I'm going to show you how to make REST API calls to Aria automation. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place.
This is part 9 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. In parts 1 through 8, we took a generic look at how to make REST API calls. But now, in parts 9 and onwards, we're going to take a look at specific VMware products. In part 9, we're going to be taking a look at how to make REST API calls to VMware Aria automation. In the previous video, we started looking at how the REST API allows us to look up information about our infrastructure. In the previous videos, we specifically talked about projects. In this video, we're going to talk about cloud accounts. So let's go down to cloud accounts and take a look at our first REST request. So in this first REST request, you can see that creating cloud accounts is actually part of the same IIS service that we looked at originally way back when we looked at the get API info request. This particular REST request and its endpoint URL is going to look up all of the cloud accounts in my vRealize automation system. So let's go over to, in my case, vRealize automation, and we're once again going to go to infrastructure, but this time we're going to go scrolling down to the bottom under connections. That's where you go to look up your cloud accounts. Now in my environment, I have a single cloud account that connects my VRA system to my vCenter server called SA-VCSA-01. And if we were to open up this thing called a cloud account, you can see that amongst other information that's specified here, we give new cloud accounts a name. Optionally, we can give them a description. But then crucially, you need to give an IP address, or in this case, we've given an FQDN that points to the vCenter server that we're connecting to. Followed by the credentials. We can validate to make certain that that connection and the credentials are correct. And in doing so, we establish a connection between VRA and our vCenter server system. In addition, for a connection to vCenter server, you're going to see a list here. After you validate, you're going to see a list here of the vSphere data centers that are available in that vCenter server. Now, in other computing environments, such as AWS and Azure and GCP, they don't have this data center concept. Instead, they call theirs regions. So if you were creating a cloud account for AWS, it's not going to ask you to select which data centers you want accessible through this cloud account. Rather, for AWS, it's going to ask you which regions, such as US-West 01. This particular vCenter server only has one data center. I've selected it, and therefore this cloud account is going to connect VRA and enable users who have access to this cloud account to build machines and operate machines in the data center called SA-Data Center. Again, if I had multiple data centers, I would just check the checkboxes for the ones that I want to expose. If I have an NX server, I would specify information here to connect VRA not just to vCenter, but the NSX manager server that's associated with that vCenter server. I'm currently not using one, so I've left that blank. And additionally, we can set up what are known as capability tags, which we talk about in our training at VMware. All right, so now you have an idea of what it looks like when you create a cloud account through the GUI. Let's go over and get information about that cloud account. In fact, what we're just about to do is going to look up information about all of the cloud accounts. I happen to only have one, but this REST request would look up all your cloud accounts. So let's go ahead and click send. When we click send, I get back a 200 code. That's good. I'm going to copy this response body. And I could look at the response body there in Postman, but I like to go over to Notepad++. I like typing Control-N, Control-V to paste it in. Then I'll type Control-Shift-P and Control-Shift-J. And I'll type Alt-0 to collapse everything over here on the left. Again, the Control-Shift-P and the Control-Shift-J are capabilities brought to you by what's known as the JSON Tools Viewer. The JSON Tools plugin, which I've talked about in a previous video. All right, so let's look at the response body that we got back on that request that's getting all of our cloud accounts. So if we expand one level, you can see we've got paging information here, but crucially, we've got this array called content. And in the content array, we see that that array only has one element, element number 0, because I only have one cloud account. Remember, over here in the GUI, we saw, let me cancel out of here, we saw in the GUI, I have one cloud account. Therefore, in our response body, we only have one array element. So let's take a look at array element 0 and see what's in there. Well, we got lots of good stuff in here. I'll leave it to you to read through the documentation to figure out the meaning of each of these, but let's look at some of the more obvious things. So I can see things like when the cloud account was created. I can see what type of cloud account it is. This one's a vSphere cloud account. It's not an AWS or an Azure or GCP. It's a vSphere cloud account. I can see other information such as the ID of this cloud account. That might be information that you need to pass into other REST requests. I can see the name of the cloud account and all sorts of other information, including this section here, this array called enabledRegions. Now, you'll recall towards the beginning of this video, I told you that if you're creating a cloud account for vCenter, you're going to need to pick which data centers you want accessible through that cloud account. On the other hand, all the other platforms like AWS, Azure, GCP, and so forth, they don't have the concept of data centers. They call them regions. So vSphere is actually the oddball out here. So even though it looks a little weird, perhaps, to see this saying regions, I hope you understand now that this is where we're going to see all of our vSphere style data centers. Or if this was AWS, it would be our AWS regions. So if we expand enabled regions, I only see one entry here because you'll recall that in our project, we only had one, hang on, it's loading. We only had one data center. Therefore, in our response body, we only see one entry in the enabled regions array. If we expand it, we can see what kind of info is in there. So what do we got? We got the name of the data center. We've got the ID of the data center. We've got information about when it was created, when it was last updated, and the cloud account that this region is associated with. So that's what the enabled regions array is about. What about this custom properties? Well, custom properties, as you can see here, gives us loads of information about the system that we're connecting to. So we know that it's an on-prem vCenter server. We know the exact build number of vCenter that it's running. We can tell other things like what's the host name, not ESXi host, but what's the network host name of our vCenter server, and loads of other information, including what version of vCenter it's running, and so forth. So as you can see, we have loads of information available to us here by making one simple REST request. But let's go back to Postman. Again, this one simple REST request gives us loads of information. But what if we change the URL slightly, and instead of doing a GET, what if we did a POST? If we switch the GET HTTP method to a POST HTTP method, that is going to create a new cloud account. And as you can see here in this demonstration, this works very similar to the previous REST request, but whereas the previous REST request did not need a request body, here we do need a request body. If you're going to post to that URL, you need a request body. And in this request body, you can see we are, in effect, defining what we want the new cloud account to look like. We want it to be a vSphere cloud account. We want it to have this description and so forth, including whatever this private key ID is. We'll talk about that in a moment. But just before I do, what I'm trying to do here in this demonstration is to give you a feel for what you're going to do here. This is quite likely not enough properties here in this request body. To find out what all the available request body properties are, you need to go into the REST API documentation. So go back to developer.vmware.com/APIs and go looking in the vRealize Automation REST APIs, and you will find this endpoint. And when you look at that endpoint's documentation, it will tell you what all the different properties are that you can set here. Now, here's an important point. While there's similarity in some of the properties that we use here for a vCenter cloud account compared to other cloud accounts like AWS, Azure, and GCP. Each cloud account type has potentially its own unique properties that you can look up in the documentation. Now, if we were to do a video that talked about all the different properties for all the different cloud account types, we would be here all day long. So I'm going to leave it to you to read through the documentation. But I will tell you one other thing that is super important to understand about the different cloud platforms. Each cloud platform has some form of authentication. It uses some form of credentials, but they vary from one platform to another. For example, in the world of vCenter, when you want to authenticate to a vCenter server, the credentials that you pass in consist of a username and a password. So whether you're logging into the vCenter server using the vSphere client or you're using REST API calls like we're doing here, you need to pass in that username and password to the cloud account that you're creating because that's the type of credentials that vCenter is expecting. On the other hand, AWS, while it has credentials, AWS does not use a username and password to authenticate you. Instead, in the world of AWS, they have something that's like a username, and they have something that's like a password, but they are called something different. So their thing that's like a username is called an access key ID. And their thing that's like a password is called a secret access key. You can read through documentation on AWS to understand this in more detail. The key point that I'm trying to get across to you is that the credentials are different for the different types of cloud platforms. So you're going to need to consult your documentation to figure out what kind of info they're expecting. And if you need to know what the username is or what the password is or the access key ID, if you need to know what those are, you go to the tools that each of the different vendors provides. So you could go into your vCenter server using the vSphere client to set your username and password. Then you'll know what the username and password is. On the other hand, if you need the credentials for AWS, you go into the AWS console, and that's where you create the account. That's where they give you the access key ID and the secret access key. Again, each platform's a little bit different, but it's the same basic idea. Join me in the next video and we'll continue looking at the Aria Automation API.